Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. We're delighted that you're here. My name is Gautam Nair. I'm an assistant professor at the Kennedy School here at Harvard. Before I introduce our terrific speakers for the day, let me say that today's event is part of the Ash Center's Global Challenges to Democracy series, which is organized by Professor Yunilda Gonzalez and myself in collaboration with our colleagues Melissa Dinello and Sophie Koritz. It is also jointly organized by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs as part of the Research Cluster on Business and Government, co-chaired by Alicia Holland, Dani Rodrik, Meg Rittmeyer, and myself, in collaboration with Diana Ocampo Belosco. We would also very much like to thank and acknowledge our co-sponsors for this event, the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia and the Mosaver Rehmani Center for Business and Government at HKS. The Ash Center acknowledges that the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. The Ash Center also acknowledges the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Today's discussion is being recorded and will be made publicly available on the Ash Center's YouTube page. So if you don't want your mother to hear something, don't say it. We are here today to discuss A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey by Devesh Kapur and Arvind Subramanian, which was one of the Financial Times Book of the Year and is sure to be a landmark work of scholarship. Devesh Kapur is the Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. A political scientist, he has written extensively on the political and institutional determinants of economic development with a focus on international migration, governance, social marginalization, and higher education. Previously held faculty positions at Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania. His other important books include Diaspora, Democracy and Development, The Impact of International Migration from India on India, which received the Distinguished Book Award of the International Studies Association, The Other 1%, Indians in America, and the World Bank, Its First Half Century. Arvind Subramanian is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. An economist, he has written widely on growth, trade, development, and the Indian economy. He served as a chief economic advisor to the government of India from 2014 to 2018, overseeing landmark reforms, including the goods and services tax and a national bankruptcy code. So everything that has gone wrong subsequently is, of course, Arvind's fault. He unfortunately cannot be with us today here in person, but he's going to speak to us over Zoom. He previously worked also at the International Monetary Fund and the GATT, and has taught at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Brown, and Ashoka universities. Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the world's top 100 global thinkers in 2011. His other books include Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Economic Dominance, and India's Turn, Understanding the Economic Transformation. Professor Dani Rodrik is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at HKS. He's an economist who has written widely and very influentially about globalization, economic development, and political economy. He's the author of many articles in the leading journals, as well as books, including the book Has Globalization Gone Too Far, 1997, so quite far ahead of its time. Economics Rules, The Rights and Wrongs of the Dismal Science, One Economics, Many Recipes, Globalization, Institutions, and Economic Growth. As a co-founder of the Reimagining the Global Economy initiative, he's recently turned his attention to the question of how to build more inclusive and equitable economies in developed and developing countries. His most recent book is Shared Prosperity in a Fractured World. So let's provide a round of applause to our distinguished speaker. The way we're going to do this is that Devesh is going to offer some remarks to kick us off. And Arvind will have a few comments on the economic front. Dani will offer some comments. I'll say a few words, and then we'll open it up for questions. Sorry, and this is the book.
Thank you so much, Gautam. Thank you all for being here. Just want to thank the Ash Center for hosting us, and for Dani. Dani has blurbed the book, so he has no option but to say nice things now about, because he can't go back on his blurb now. It's a bit late. So what I'm going to do is just, do you guys, you able to see this? Okay. So, I mean, obviously, we're not going to talk about the book. We'll just pick a couple of themes from the book. So, what I just want to start is just give you a very brief thing about what is distinctive about this book. So, I think broadly, our Arvind and I sort of understanding is that development is not something that you can approach through a single discipline, but of course, we study it through our disciplines. So we deliberately wanted to make this a very interdisciplinary book. We did not approach this book with strong prior hypotheses. We wanted the arguments to flow out of the data. For that, we put together and read about 3,000 official government reports and documents. So the data in this book is almost entirely primary data. It's not secondary data. And it encompasses, in most cases, 6 to 7 decades. The other is that we wanted to compare and look at India over time, across space, across India, but also to compare it with other development experiences. And of course, the most obvious comparator is the other giant, which is China. The book has no prescriptions at all. We have one in one line, but we can talk about it later. So it's not about saying what India should do. Everyone and his uncle has opinions on that, and we don't want to get into that. So very loosely, a framework. I think the development challenge was to reconfigure a colonial state and make it a development state, to transform one of the most hierarchical societies in the world, most unequal, to forge a sense of nationhood among multiple languages, ethnic groups, and to create markets to build a modern economy. Distinctively, India tried to do this right from the beginning through universal franchise. Other countries, as I'll show you, followed different paths. Here, in this presentation, we're going to only focus on two themes. Precociousness, what were the consequences of India's choosing the democracy before the development? I'll talk about that, and then Arvind will talk about 4 misconceptions about India's growth. Broadly speaking, the theme of precociousness is really what it means. What we mean is unusual sequencing. So broadly speaking, India did democracy before development, services before manufacturing, globalization of high-skilled talent through migration before low-skilled exports, welfare before public goods, state capitalism before public infrastructure, physical capital before human capital, higher education over primary education, and enacting more and more laws without developing the capacity to implement them. Now, if you look at successful development models, right? One is the quintessential Western US, UK model. Democracy grows as income grows. The second model is the East Asian, Korea, Taiwan. First, the development until you are reaching middle income status, then you see the democracy increasing. The third is China, massive economic development, no the democracy. India, as you can see, complete outlier, right? Very low incomes, and it begins the journey to democracy. So one way, if you can look at it, if you look at the income at full franchise, you can see just how much India was an outlier compared to many other countries whose story we are aware of. And it was an outlier both at the very low income at which full franchise was given, but also in a country that was deeply patriarchal. It still is very patriarchal, but at that time, much more so. It gave franchise to men and women at the same time, which again, most countries, there was a large gap between the two. So what were the consequences of this? So one of the consequences we point out is that, often in academic settings at institutions like this, there are lots of seminars on violence in India. We argue that actually the story of India's development is not how much, but how small violence was in the course of nation building. India is a complete outlier, that in the process of development, how little violence, mass violence I'm talking about, that took place. When you take the US, in the process of nation building, you have this civil war, 2% of the population is killed. You apply that to India, that would be 30 million people. That's what we mean by mass violence. The only mass violence is what occurs at partition, but that was not sort of driven by the state. It was more between society. So here what you see is per capita income and fatalities as a percentage of population in the course of the nation building. And you see countries like Vietnam and Korea, as we know, you had massive wars in these places in the course of nation building and very high fatalities as a share of the population. In India, relatively speaking. So one of the things we make the argument is that many countries, nation building was through a single language, single religion, single ethnicity. India very distinctly chose a path of nation building where democracy was the instrument of nation building. And we make arguments why that was the reason that violence, mass violence, was much less. So building order, if that was political order with very low levels of mass violence, if that was one very positive outcome, another very positive outcome is that India also avoided what a manifestation of disorder for economists, which is hyperinflation, right? Hyperinflation is a symptom of extreme economic disorder. And here, when you compare inflation in India with a set of other developing countries that includes Korea, Taiwan, and so on and so forth, sort of Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, here also you see that India avoided mass sort of hyperinflation. And one of the reasons we show is that in India, the poor vote, the likelihood of the poor voting is very high. India has a very large number of poor. And in the sense, democracy was the key monetary anchor rather than an independent central bank and things like that, because the politicians were very, very conscious of the electoral cost of high inflation. However, we also say that, look, democracy had its costs. So the phrase, and this is, Arvind's way of sort of bringing out the phrase called the Kamdhenu state. The Kamdhenu is the sort of Hindu goddess, the bovine, which gives everything to everyone in a sense. So the Indian state, and what this graph is showing you, in the period of massive growth after the 90s, India has had by far the highest fiscal deficits. Normally, when you grow very fast, tax revenues grow fast, and your deficits go down. Just the opposite. And that's, of course, we show because the pressures of the democracy, electoral competition have meant that you don't tax, everyone gets exemptions, whether it's the rich, the middle class, the rich farmers, etc., and everyone gets some handouts in one form or the other. More expenditures, less revenues, high fiscal deficits. A second consequence we point out is that elections, so what you see is that between the 50s and 60s and now, the number of election days the percentage of population covered, and the election-free interval for states, all of those have changed, that India has become almost a perpetual electoral machine. There are national, state, local elections, urban local body elections. So the time horizons of politicians has become shorter and shorter. The ability to take the decisions on issues like administrative reform, where the payoffs occur over years, that is simply much less likely to happen because the time horizons, because elections have become, and we show in other work, elections in India are costly. You cannot have democracy without elections. You cannot have elections without money. And when you have so many elections, you need to raise a lot of money. And that's a core reason why corruption in India is high, because every politician is raising money all the time. It's a story we are familiar in the democratic context as well, which you're all aware. So, there's been this argument from Hasamaglu, from Robinson about the democracy and the development, what a strong relationship there is. However, we show there are two massive outliers. The largest countries in the world are complete outliers to their argument. China achieved massive development without democracy, and India, relative to its average democracy index, achieved much, much less. In fact, India is an outlier even among democracies. As you can see, there were other authoritarian countries, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, etc., which also achieved economic growth. India, however, you see, is a real outlier, even among the democracies, in that economic development was slower relative to its achievements in the democracy. Now we'll turn to growth and hand to Arvind.
Thanks, Devesh. Thanks, Gautam, and to the ASH Center for inviting us. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a particular privilege to be presenting this book in front of with Dani as the moderator, because the first paper that I ever wrote on India was my co-conspirator and co-author was Dani, and so I owe a lot.
So you have the blame now.
Yeah, so Dani is culpable for a lot of this book as well. Yeah, so as Devesh said, we cover a lot of ground in the book, and Devesh focused on precociousness, and I want to focus especially because of this audience, to say something about the Indian growth and development experience, and had Devesh not been my co-author, sober, wise Devesh holding me back, I would have called these set of chapters, "Everything you know about Indian growth and policy is wrong." But I can't say that because Devesh will get annoyed with me. But that's the sense we want to convey in the book, that we've kind of misunderstood India's almost entire growth trajectory and policy things. So the next slide, please, Devesh. So broadly, I think there were four periods of, distinctive periods, both of growth and policy in India. The first 30 years, then the 10-year period, 1980, basically the 80s, then the phase when India reformed, 1991 to about the mid-2010s, and then the last period, after the global financial crisis. Now, we argue in the book that each of these episodes or periods has been kind of misdiagnosed, and we kind of set it up as a slight caricature where we say, what does the left say about all these periods? What does the right say about all these periods? And of course, how the wise Devesh and Arvind come and say all these guys are wrong and we are right. And that's the way we kind of set up this. But jokes apart, there is, I think, a serious misunderstanding. So I want to take you through this period by period, right? So planning, I think there are two misconceptions about the planning period. One, the revisionist view of the first 30 years in India is that this was a period not of the economic performance was not bad given the circumstances, especially if you see how India did in this period or over the preceding three periods of colonial rule. And what we argue is that not only was growth poor relative to all other countries in the world, it was particularly bad if you were to compare to China, which I'll just show you, and also that there was very little structural transformation in this period. Poverty was high and stagnant. Educational attainment was stagnant. On trade, we reversed. Going from 2% of global market share, we went to 0.5, et cetera, et cetera. And on the policy side, what we argue is that, a fundamental misconception is that this is a period of import substitution. And we argue that this is wrong because, when you do import substitution, the aim is to protect domestic entrepreneurs, public and private. But what India did most uniquely amongst, I think, countries following this policy was it did the import substitution in terms of the protection and keeping out foreign competition, but in turn it turned around and kind of stymied and taxed the domestic private sector. So it became a regime of scarcity rather than a regime of import substitution per se. So Devesh, can you just go one slide? So this chart, I just want you to look at the first 30 years to show that India was 79th percentile ranking in 1950 on per capita GDP. That is 79% of countries were better off than India. By 1980, it was actually 85th. So that India deteriorated in the first 30 years in relative terms compared to the world as a whole. And the next slide, please, Devesh. And so this comparison, I think, is pretty important because, as Devesh said, China is an obvious comparator. And what is striking about this period is that China was in absolute chaos in terms of instability. Political instability, economic instability. You had all the rectification campaign, the 100 Flowers campaign, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. And this is a chart which kind of is a proxy for all that instability. The black market premium, this is data, of course, from Carmen and others. You see that the black market premium was just extraordinarily great in China compared to India. And yet what you find is that in 1962, at the trough of the Great Leap Forward, and even so, in 1950, India and China were comparable on many, many indicators, economic and social. 1962, India had pulled ahead on all these measures, but by 1980, within a 20-year period, China had pulled ahead of India on all these. So there was a kind of reversal of fortune between China and India. And so already by 1980, and all this happened despite extreme instability, economic and political, in China. So the notion that somehow India did reasonably well is kind of, I think, belied by the evidence and the comparison with India. Devesh, can you go back to the two slides, please? Then the second period, if the first period was not import substitution, the 80s is what Dani and I wrote about. This is a period where, in fact, growth takes off, and which is kind of derided by the right, saying it was unsustainable Keynesianism, and the left said it was all about public sector-led growth. We show that that's not the case. More importantly, I think, or as important, this was in fact the true era of import substitution. What in the paper with Dani we called, pro-business rather than pro-market reform. It was really a case of import substitution. Then I think the third phase, I think it's completely misunderstood. We know it was a phase of neoliberalism. And in fact, what is distinctive about this phase is that India had East Asian outcomes on trade and growth. I mean, it's India's trade growth, export growth in manufacturing was the third highest in the world for about 20, 25 years, not just in services. Um, and India got the East Asian growth and East Asian trade growth, but very distinctively, it did not follow East Asian policies. Very little of the stuff that now Dani and all the people in Harvard are enamored with, very little industrial policy, very little mercantilist policy, plain vanilla Washington consensus policies led to that. And of course, so you had the East Asian growth and trade, but you did not have East Asian policies. And sadly, you did not have East Asian structural transformation. And in some ways, I think one of the biggest puzzles about India, when we talk about structural transformation, is look, when countries don't grow, I mean, you don't expect structural transformation. So that's kind of trivial. But what is, I think, unusual about India is that for about 30, 35 years, it had very rapid growth, amongst the highest in the world, and yet it not get the structural transformation. And Devesh, can you go 3 slides ahead, please?
This must be per capita.
Yeah, next slide, please. Next slide, please, Devesh.
Okay. Yeah.
This, of course, is well known. It shows, the 3 sectors. India does too much agriculture for too long, too little formal manufacturing for too long, and too much and too early high-skilled services. And this is the lack of structural transformation. Next slide, and the more interesting is the international counterpart of this. Devesh, next slide, please. And on the left, what you see is, and this is based on, Devesh's excellent work on the diaspora. We show, what is, various immigrant communities in the United States. You take their per capita income in the United States and compare it with the per capita income in the country of origin. You do that for all these immigrant groups. India turns out to be the highest, not very surprising. And of course, we know the Indian elite overexploited globalization through migration, and that's what you see on the left. But there was a flip side and a serious cost to this lack of structural transformation, which is kind of the precociousness on the economic side. You do services, but not formal manufacturing. And what you see on the right-hand side on the y-axis is the share in global exports of low-skill manufacturers. On the x-axis is the share of working-age population. They should be roughly related. India and China, again, complete outliers on opposite sides. China and India about 22% of the global labor force, but China has about 40 to 50% of global labor skill imports even today, and India has 3 to 4%. And so this gap between what India should have had and what it actually achieved is the thwarted structural transformation, leading to a tremendous loss in jobs and formal manufacturing. And in a sense, the elites overexploited globalization, but in the Indian labor force, unskilled labor force, was shortchanged by not exploiting globalization enough. Next slide. And of course, so once you look at growth, India throws up another big surprise. So this is a chart that plots per capita GDP from 1980 to today, or 2020, for the Indian states, and puts it alongside other countries in the world. And we hear this wistfulness always expressed in India. Oh, why doesn't India grow as rapidly as China? But what Devesh and I found is that 1/3 of the Indian states, the South, the West, and Haryana, grew almost as rapidly as China and for almost as long. So it is not the case that India did not go as rapidly as China. It's just that 2/3 of India, basically the Hindi heartland, did not grow as rapidly as the remaining 1/3 of India did. And this kind of puts a completely different complexion on the Indian growth story as well. Moving on, Devesh, let me conclude now by offering our final assessment on this. The magic and paradox, which Devesh spoke about, democracy and how India sustained and nurtured it under very inhospitable conditions, something that Ashu has also worked on. The under-recognized achievement, democracy, the instrumental achievement of democracy to get nation building, order, state building without violence. I've shown you the delayed and partial success on economic growth. The durable disappointment, of course, has been on better human capabilities, health, education, a sense of fraternity, the inability to break the stranglehold of a patriarchal and hierarchical society. Next chart. Next slide, please, Devesh. And this just plots the same thing, a human development index. India starts out in 1950, 63rd in percentile rankings. And even 2021 today, its relative position has only deteriorated. So the durable disappointment is on human capital, and that's, and related pathologies. Next and last slide, please. The abiding irony. So we have the magic and paradox, the under-recognized achievement, the delayed and partial success, the durable disappointment. The abiding irony, Devesh alluded to, democracy both gave and took away. And we have other examples of how democracy, imposed a tax on India, as it were. And we end, the looming tragedy is, India's early, precious, fragile achievements, democracy, strong institutions, political freedoms, good relations between the center and the state, cooperative federalism, all those, like the software of development, as it were, which many countries around the world this software is still proving elusive for many, many countries around the world, and countries are slipping as well. And the looming tragedy for India is that we just as economic progress, state building is being undertaken, these early achievements of democracy, federalism, and nation building are under threat now. And just to preempt, so what we say by way of prescription at the end is basically do no harm and do not allow these precious, early, fragile achievements to be squandered away, as seems to be happening today in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great. It's great to be here and to talk about this book. Actually, I had prepared pages and pages of devastating criticism until Devesh reminded me that I'm on the back cover as one of the endorsers of the book. So I stand by what I said in the back of the book. This is actually an incredibly rich and detailed book. I personally learned everything anything I know about India from Devesh and Arvind. So what can I say? I can recite a poem, as I'm sure many of you are been playing with Claude recently, and so I was on the one hand just reviewing the book, and then I thought, well, why don't I ask Claude to write a poem based on this book, and this is what it produced. The precocious nation. We voted before we could read, chose parliament over the plow, gave franchise to the hungry before we showed them how. The license strangled the mill, the mansion ignored the school, a sixth of all humanity governed by its own misrule. Services rose where factories should, the talented left on a plane, Democracy became a goddess all could milk, none could restrain. Yet there we stand, fractious, vast, no civil war, no throne reclaimed. Perhaps the miracle isn't the lag, but the union that somehow remained. So
I think you should have told us to use AI.
yeah,
It would have been a much better book.
I also asked Claude to produce a stand-up comedy routine. And it came out pretty good. I'm going to give this to you. It's too long to read, but it's a lot of fun. But I think it's the ending of the poem is really the point, isn't it? Perhaps the miracle isn't the lag, but the union that somehow remained.
Yeah.
And that points to sort of this great tension, both in the nation itself, what makes India very frustrating to understand, but also in some ways makes this book frustrating, which is the ambiguity that runs throughout the whole thing. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? What was the plausible counterfactual? And as Devesh said, there is no sort of, just strictly non-prescriptive. And then when Arvind came out with the prescription at the end, it turns out don't do anything different. But then maybe what the miracle is that the union somehow remained, and you had a country that past the partition, you did not have the state committing violence on its people, and you had this extraordinary period of macroeconomic instability during decades where most of the developing countries went through at least, one debt crisis, one, inflationary episode, all the things that, we would have thought that the short-termism of democracy would have produced in an extremely poor developing country, yet somehow India managed to avoid. So, is there anything about India's economic performance that we could sort of, backward deduce from its political institutions and democracy? I find it very hard to think what those might be. So the idea of a precautious democracy, I'm resisting a little bit because it's not entirely clear, even in the book's own rendition, whether the problems that happened or the disappointments were the result of democracy per se, or perhaps an imperfect democracy that could have functioned a little bit better. I mean, the book spends a lot of time talking about how democracy was perverted and corrupted by strong, powerful business interests, and how those vested interests determined policy outcomes both during the various phases of import substitution and then subsequently after the liberalization. So maybe it is the perversion of democracy and the power of corporate lobbies that is the problem. And you would have thought everything else being the same, an authoritarian regime might have been even more prone to that. So by the same token, it's not entirely clear why we can credit democracy for macroeconomic stability. And Devesh, you were saying that politicians learn very quickly that not to inflate, because that would have been in a democracy perhaps too costly. On the other hand, that's not the usual story in most democracies, that in Latin America and elsewhere, we tend to associate short-termism with imprudent macroeconomic policies and so forth. So there is this ambiguity that, many times reading the book, I'm just sort of saying, okay, make up your mind, what's this? And sometimes I say, oh, this is Arvind and Devesh fighting. And then they say, oh, they can't reach a conclusion and they'll just sort of leave it as is. And then I say, well, maybe it's a way of, telling us what India is in an indirect way, because, India is a land of paradoxes and all of that. And sort of, it's very hard to make generalizations about a nation that's so large and so heterogeneous, and maybe the book just reflects that in what it's talking about. So it is very much a feature rather than a bug. So there is that central ambiguity, and lack of clarity with respect to democracy, whether I should say not about the benefits of democracy, but some of the false attributed to democracy with respect to economic underperformance. There is this whole sort of this ambiguity and uncertainty about the focus on services versus manufacturing, as Arvind was describing. India has been very different in terms of having focus on a services-led path of growth. And is this necessarily a good thing or a bad thing? Well, looking backwards, maybe it's sort of a bad thing, because during a period when a lot of countries could generate a lot of jobs in manufacturing through export-oriented industrialization, that was something that was missed out on by India. But maybe looking forward, that's a good thing, because I don't think it's going to be possible for countries to replicate that East Asian experience. Even China today is losing workers in manufacturing by tens of millions of people. And so it's going forward, having actually established a basis in services may bode India quite well in terms of its position going forward. I'm sure I don't recall if you talk about that paper by Michael Peters and Zilibotti at Yale about sort of the services-led model in India.
Right.
But what's striking in that paper is just not the high-skill services, but it's, if you believe their productivity estimates, even sort of low-skill services, consumer services like retail and trade services, productivity growth seems to have been more rapid actually than in manufacturing. And that's exactly going to be those services where most of the jobs are going to be created. So that's actually, if that is true, that's a great thing for India. So maybe again, it's not such a bad thing that India took a rather different path here in terms of its structural transformation path. And let me just, as a final point, maybe this is more of a question to Arvind and Devesh, is when you compare India and China, one of the things that would lead you to be much more optimistic about India's future than China's is that, if we think about democratization as one of the institutional transformations, political transformations that every society has eventually to get through if they want to have a society that can fully benefit from information and all the advantages of disseminated technology and so forth. China is very far from having gone through that transformation, and yet obviously India has done it from the get-go, although there is some regression obviously happening right now. But in a real sense, the fundamental institutional transformation that of opening up the political system to a broader set of voices and broader participation and different views and opinions is a transformation that is in India's past, whether it is still a challenge that's in China's future. And I wonder if that also is a reason that sort of would one might view the future of India in a comparative perspective in a much brighter way. But again, thanks for this amazing book. I think Arvind said that it's a book about why everything about India is wrong. I thought he was going to say everything you wanted to know about India is in this book, so it's just not that bad a description. It's incredibly rich and detailed. So you should read it all.
Thank you, Dani.
So let me just start by congratulating Arvind and Devesh for this incredible work of scholarship. Some books are really just articles in disguise, which are just spread very thinly across many chapters. And this is certainly not one of those. It's very large and ambitious in scope. And it sort of is befitting in that sense a country that is almost like a continent and a journey that is indeed something like an Odyssey. So I actually invited Arvind and Devesh to come before I got my copy sent mail from India. So I had not realized it was 600 pages with another 100 pages of notes. And I'll be honest, I was regretting my decision. But having plumbed its depths, literally, I have to say that the book actually repays again and again close and thorough reading. So there are some very big themes and puzzles that kind of course through the book. How did India balance democracy and development? What explains its distinctive pattern of development? We've already talked about the emphasis on services. Where did the state succeed and fail? Like its subject, the book sort of defies easy summary. It contains lots of different ideas, and more or less every chapter sort of provides a new window into India's social, political, and economic development. And actually, I would say that Arvind and Devesh, although their presentation was excellent, it really cannot do justice to the book, which has so many interesting ideas in it. And the authors, to their credit, they really resist the temptation to boil down this story into a few simplistic, catchy arguments, a 2x2, which is much beloved by political scientists. And they look at the problems from many different directions and really let the data speak. And these data take a truly amazing variety of forms. It covers everything from government reports to cross-country data. We learned that India had about 23,400 post offices in 1947, and now it has something like 150,000. They tell us about the number of temples under government management. So it turns out the state in India is a very enthusiastic manager of temples, as well as the share of government securities in state-run banks. So the tax system, for example, actually in large measure works through the banking system. And that's a big reason why private banks were nationalized in the 1970s to meet these redistributive demands. And even today, banks play a huge role as basically buying government securities and redistributing it through priority sector lending. The authors also worry about things like the civil registration of births and deaths, and how the number of schools in villages has changed over time. So there's just an amazing amount of data. Okay. Now, along the way, the book overturns a lot of conventional wisdom. For instance, as Arvind already mentioned, contrary to much writing, India didn't really pursue a policy of import substitution industrialization. So there was the import substitution aspect of it. The industrialization did not take place because there was a thicket of regulations that a lot of the private enterprise was strangling, right? And despite instances of insurgency, one could think of insurgencies in Punjab, in Kashmir, in the Northeast, for example, and some degree of ethnic conflict. As Devesh mentioned, India has actually been quite peaceful by world standards. So it suffered nothing like the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward, which killed tens of millions of people in China. And even today, we are actually living in an era of relative peace. So, fatalities and insurgencies and riots and so on are all at a multi-decade low. Now, more broadly and theoretically, and I don't think this is a point that's, I think is made in the book, but perhaps not as robustly as it could be, a lot of the consensus in the social sciences is that state building has happened through war fighting. That is that states construct, tax systems, meritocratic civil services, all of these things when they face competitors in the international system that threaten to make them extinct. And what the Indian experience actually shows is that a lot of state building actually took place after independence in a relatively benign security environment. Meaning, you wouldn't say that India is in a friendly neighborhood, but it's nothing like 19th century Europe. And yet we observe the expansion of a meritocratic civil service, for example, a more capable tax system, all of these things that are happening largely through peaceful mechanisms. And that's actually quite new and important. Okay. So let me offer a few questions. And these sort of follow on to some extent from what Dani just mentioned. Now, a major thrust of the book concerns the relationship between democracy and public policy, right? So for instance, the authors note that India has really avoided high and variable inflation, except in the 1970s with the oil shocks, which also preceded the one period in which you had the emergency where you had a suspension of democratic competition, right? So there's an economic story to that. And they suggest that this lack of inflation, of hyperinflation, is due to the salience of prices for poor voters. So yesterday I had a look at the data because this is a very striking phenomenon. And what I did is to basically ask the question, let's predict inflation in countries in every given year as a function of per capita income, democracy, and some other determinants subsequently, like trade flows and all that. Okay. Now, what this is asking, this plot is asking is, well, if we use that regression and we predict what India's inflation rate is, we see that India is much lower than we would expect, even holding fixed its democracy. That means that there's something else in addition to democracy that is driving this outcome. Okay? So democracy by itself cannot really explain why India doesn't suffer the macroeconomic variability that a lot of other countries have done. Related, the authors mentioned, as Arvind just did, that there's enormous variation in the per capita living standards of people living in different states in India, right? So Tamil Nadu, for example, now has living standards that are, in per capita terms, that are about 3.5 times that in Uttar Pradesh, right? And they started at a very similar level in the 1960s, I think. And this is also seen in lots of other measures. Now, what is notable about states in India is that they are all governed by more or less identical political institutions, right? That is, they have first past the post system, they have electoral competition. And so how do we explain this variation? Only with reference to democracy. We need something more. And presumably that has something to do with political mobilization, the coalitions that underpin political parties, and so on. And given that some countries, some states in India are growing at China-like growth rates, that actually is a pretty positive story for democracy. It suggests that, well, actually, high rates of growth are perfectly compatible with democracy. Okay? Relatedly, I think that this also suggests, in passing, I'd like to make this point, that there's a lot more room for learning, not just from other countries like, say, China or Japan or South Korea, but really across states. That is, that Uttar Pradesh and Bihar have a lot to learn from Tamil Nadu, and to the extent that we can create new institutions that enable that type of learning, that might actually be very helpful for other states and in reducing some of these disparities. Okay? Relatedly, a third and striking phenomenon that Kapur and Subramanian document in the book is that state-owned enterprises in India have been a massive destroyer of resources because they've been so poorly run and they endured for such a long time. So, the government was engaged in making everything from watches to steel, extracting coal, running railways and airlines. So Air India, for example, famously accumulated $10 billion in losses before it was finally privatized, right? Now, this is a puzzle because even today, if you look at, this is basically data on the composition of different types of spending, right? And a lot of emphasis is given to social welfare transfers in the debates on public policy in India. And about 1.8% of GDP, based on this data from Devesh and Arvind's book, is spent on social welfare. But 2.2% is actually spent on pensions. And this fraction, the amount of money that's spent on pensions, is only growing. And there are a few million people who are employed by the government in India. And what's striking is that so much time and resources are spent in catering to this relatively thin group of people. People spend years preparing for exams to join the government. And this is also an enormous loss. And one would think, from a politician's perspective, why can't you take that money and spend it in other groups and buy a lot of votes and win election again and again? So this is a puzzle that I don't have an answer for, but I would love to know Arvind and Devesh's thoughts. Fourth, I'd like to know the author's views on the rise of social welfare transfers through digital public infrastructure. So India, as many of you know, has become a pioneer in the use of digital transfers in mobile technologies, in efficiently delivering what used to be a very leakage-prone welfare system, literally delivering resources to people. And what is striking is that, on the one hand, this seems like a no-brainer. If you have a lot of leakage of the system, it was thought that only maybe a fifth of the grain that was distributed through India's public distribution system reached its intended beneficiaries in the 1980s. And now you're getting 100% transfer to people's bank accounts. The trouble is that now that politicians have this wonderful tool, all of electoral competition is now based on, for example, cash transfers to farmers or women and many other worthy groups. It just costs a lot of money, maybe about $25 billion a year. And other social welfare programs, like India's public distribution system for food, have actually been untouched. So it's sort of old transfers plus new transfers rather than replacement, right? So 800 million people get their food grain through the system. It costs about a percentage point of GDP. It's a massive transfer, and it's really non-colony. So the question I'd like to ask is, well, maybe it's economically efficient on this dimension, but maybe in the long run it's economically inefficient because, as we learned, India has not done very well on human development indicators, and perhaps political competition will simply be based on this type of welfare rather than on the provision of things like education. Finally, I'm interested in the author's views on how we should view the future. On the one hand, when I travel in India, if I go to Odisha, Gujarat, or Telangana, or Tamil Nadu, I see lots of visible progress everywhere, right? Gradually, India is getting better and better. There's high rates of political participation and robust electoral competition. So even at the national level, the BJP, which is sometimes thought to be like a monopoly, only wins about 37% of the vote. So the other parties are doing pretty well in keeping up, despite all the varied disadvantages that they face, right? And there have been some efforts, recent reforms, for example, new trade deals, which are opening up and reforming India, which has a notoriously closed system. The Byzantine value-added tax system has been simplified significantly. And so, there are perhaps, positive signs. On the other hand, as Arvind and Devesh mentioned, there are lots of worries about illiberalism. Huge states which contain tens of millions of people, like Bihar, are completely stagnant now. They are not really growing very fast. And global economic integration and international peace have been very good for India. So there's an influential line of thought going back to Kapur, Roy, which is that India did very well in the first globalization, which ended after the First World War. It stagnated subsequently when it was living under autarky in the 1950s to 1990s. Again, it stagnated. It's only really when it integrated itself into the global trading system did it see much more rapid economic growth. And that now seems to be under threat. And all of this raises the question of whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic about the future of democracy and development in India. Now, when I read this book and I just see how far India has come in the last 75 years, I personally feel pretty hopeful because these problems don't seem to be as insoluble as those ones. And so maybe we should expect that 1/6 of humanity still has a bright future. Doomsdayers notwithstanding. So I'll leave it there and we open it up.
Do you want to first open it up? Or do you want us to?
I think you should open it.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, let's take some questions. Please introduce yourself briefly and ask a question, ideally with a question mark.
Greetings, sir. Thank you for the insightful talk. My question is to Arvind, sir. The economic surveys during your time as chief economic advisor talked about new welfareism, which entailed public provision of private goods through DBT, like cooking gas, toilets. In the current times, that has been transformed into unconditional cash transfers, particularly to women prior to elections, like we have seen Ladki Behan in Maharashtra and Ladli Behna in Madhya Pradesh. How far do you think this is sustainable economically as well as politically? Thank you.
Here, there's one other question.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. My name is Varun. My question is to Devesh, sir. Like, in terms of talking about democracy and development, how far should we delineate like the initial phase of India from 1950s to 1980s in terms of democracy versus electoral competition or political competition? Because as we know, there was a hegemony of the Congress system. And the moment that sort of broke off in the late 70s, we saw takeoff of India's growth, right? So when we talk about democracy, how far should we talk about actual democracy or like electoral competition versus democracy that elections are happening?
Arvind, do you want to answer the question?
I don't know how, Devesh, shall we just kind of, should we answer the questions, also respond to Dani and Gautam? I mean,
So both. So why don't you start? Why don't you go ahead, Arvind? Yeah, start.
Sorry, should I start?
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, there's firstly, thanks, Dani, Gautam, for, exceptionally insightful remarks. There's just so much to respond to, so I don't know. I'm just going to pick and choose the easy ones and kind of elide over the difficult ones. But a couple of responses to Dani. So Dani, I mean, you said, what if you kind of, I mean, what can we attribute to democracy and not to democracy, and how that shaped things? So I think that's a very fair and important question. And there in our, we responded to Pranab Bardhan, who asked a similar question. And see, the thing is that clearly there were some early choices that were related to democracy. For example, the most important, or one of the key ones, I mean, Devesh will talk about education, but for example, on land reforms, which was so critical to the East Asian success, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, China, I think India was not able to do those land reforms. I mean, in part because of democracy, because, the Congress party, especially in the States, was beholden to a landed interest who were a big supporter, and that kind of stymied land reform. And you could argue that had really consequential effects going forward. But then on the other hand, if you talk about, the licensing, the industrial licensing, I mean, that really had nothing to do either with democracy or with kind of, any kind of, the zeitgeist of the time, import substitution. It had nothing to do with that either. It just had to do with, some combination of, we must not allow the private sector to become too big, et cetera, et cetera. But it had really nothing to do with democracy per se. So I think there were choices that were related to democracy and that choices that were orthogonal, which I think, and maybe that contributes to the frustration of wanting to, pin everything down on one thing or the other. On services versus manufacturing, a little bit, I have to kind of disagree with Dani, because Dani, firstly, clearly there were huge costs, 35 years, 40 years, not being able to provide manufacturing jobs for a vast swathe of the population. I think it's just a major development failure. For example, even today, the proportion of the labor force in the organized sector is still 10%, a measly 10%. So India is providing good jobs to, good, reasonably well-paid, high productivity jobs to a very small fraction of the population. Now, is it going to help us going forward? I mean, the paper that you mentioned, Dani, if actually, low-skilled services productivity were actually doing so well, I think you would see much more formalization and much more organized sector jobs for those things. So I think the jury is out. Finally, what I would say, where I really kind of maybe slightly disagree with Dani, is that going forward, no question, manufacturing cannot be the same pathway that it was before. But think of the following arithmetic. China has 40 to 50% of the global of low-skill manufacturing export share. India has 3%. India will never get to 20%. But even if India goes from 3 to 12, 15%, and even allowing for how not as labor intensive as it would be before, I think India still could get a lot of manufacturing jobs, provided China's were to vacate this space. So I think a strategy going forward cannot rule out low skill manufacturing entirely, and it will have to have some amount of that as well. Um, on some of Gautam's very insightful points, see, let me just respond to two. Same democratic institutions, but different outcomes. Uh, just make 2 points. One, of course, is the early reform. So the starting point is different because the early reform movements in the South, especially Kerala and Tamil Nadu, created human capital outcomes and kind of broke down caste hierarchy to a much greater extent than in other states, which of course, we have some data in the books showing that in the mid 60s, the spending on education by the southern states in Tamil Nadu were very high, or the highest, even though these states at that point were not the richest states. They were kind of middle of the pack. So those social reform movements were very happy. And the second point I would make, which kind of relates to maybe the last question which was asked, is that essentially what happens after 1980 when this real, divergence among states starts is that in the first 30 years, there's kind of political centralization, policy centralization, and fiscal centralization. So all these start loosening after 1980. So in a sense, states acquire more agency after 1980, which is what then leads to some of the divergent outcomes that you see. Last thing I will say is on welfareism, cash transfers, and so on. And then, sorry, already I've taken too long. What I didn't speak about is that essentially the fourth phase of growth after 2010 is what we characterize as welfareism, because that's the one common thread that runs through both the UPA and the NDA that comes afterwards. And this is a question also that responds to Dani. So Dani, if you didn't believe the official figures and trusted, what we say, essentially one could argue that it's precisely because growth slows down after 2010 level that you kind of see the rise of welfareism. Under the UPA government, the welfareism takes the form of, the employment guarantee scheme and the food security scheme. Under the Modi government, you get the same impulse, but it manifests in different ways. First, the new welfareism, public provision of essential private goods and services, but culminating in cash transfers. Now, point, of course, cash transfers have become the currency of competitive populism. I think it's fairly serious because they, as Gautam said, they come on top of instead of other schemes. So I think fiscally India is, headed for dangerous territory that I think is very important. But I do think there is some sense that this cash transfers is some kind of equilibrium between the citizens and the state, because citizens say, you're not going to give me health and education. You're useless at providing that. Give me the cash transfers. It's a more credible promise. Let me take it. The state, on the other hand, also recognizes that it can't kind of deliver these things. And so, it actually gains credibility because with cash transfers and the digital public infrastructure, it can promise and deliver, because it's been very successful. So in a sense, I think we're in this kind of low level political equilibrium, and cash transfers have become the currency of that, or the glue that creates this political equilibrium. which of course doesn't bode very well for the provision of health and education going forward. And we'll have to wait and see politically where this leads us in the future. Sorry, Devesh, now your turn.
So just some brief remarks. I think, Gautam, our point about democracy and inflation was about avoiding hyperinflation. India has high fiscal deficit, so you would actually expect it to have, usually high fiscal deficits translate to higher inflation. So the point was that democracy was a check on hyperinflation, so extreme disorder, just as it was a check on extreme disorder on the political front. So that was the only deal. So it was a weaker statement in a sense. I think, look, this whole thing of democracy and development comes up so many complex ways. I think the one thing that it's a complex term that is often reduced to, are the elections competitive, all of that, and some things to say about civil liberties. But I think what has happened in the US in the last year has persuaded me to go back and think about the book. Look, US institutions have not changed. I mean, they have all the formal trappings that everyone likes to tick off. But it's a different country, right? And I think the one thing that really is very distinctive about the early decades was a democratic sensibility among elites. And by sensibility, I mean, compromise, debate. You don't treat your opponent as your enemy. The give and take, the messiness of democracy in the sense. You actually attend, the prime minister actually is in parliament when the debates are taking place, no matter how much he's abused or whatever. He's willing to respond, he's willing to take time. And above all, if you see, I think what amazes me is we think these were the golden years. Actually, they were not. There's an extraordinary report, which only the government of India could do in 1961, before the Chinese war with China. It's called the Committee on Emotional Integration. And so what does the Committee on Emotional Integration? Well, they are extremely worried that India is falling apart. That there is, you have massive language riots in Assam, you have huge things in Tamil Nadu, you have linguistic, all sorts of things. And so there's a lot of thing on why this is happening, and that we need to think about emotional integration among the people and what are the things that we need to do, etc. So actually, before the committee things takes off, there's the war with China. The 60s are the one time where war makes nation building, because you have 3 wars, and so all these other things, internal, of course, get more, because now it's harder to bring up these issues when the wars are going on. But the fact is, there were severe problems. We should not airbrush that somehow this is the golden halcyon period, everyone is happy and thrilled and so on. No, there's a lot of crappiness going on. But they attempt to grapple with it, think through it, and that really made me think, especially in contrast, and thinking about the US now, about an elite sensibility. If you don't have that, all these formal trappings, I guess I disagree a lot with Asama Robinson, these institutions. Human beings in their story are irrelevant. And we are seeing human beings do matter. Leaders do matter. If elites lack a democratic sensibility, institutions can only do that much. And I think we should always, at least I think, in doing this story, that, was something that really, struck me. I think this thing you mentioned about pensions, one of the reasons is actually the numbers are higher than you might think of the number of people because it includes pensions to the army. The army, they retire at much lower ages, so the pension period is much longer. So what we see is both in the Indian army and in government hiring. So Danny, one of the things in the book we show is the Indian state is one of the smallest in the world when you normalize by population. And it has one of the highest vacancies. Every politician promises the government jobs. So why is it so small? Right? And in fact, what we show is 40% of India's now the government is contract labor. And a big part is the pressures of pensions. We're trying to find so many ways to avoid permanent employment in order to, and these pressures, the more these cash transfers are flying, the fiscal crowding out effect on investment, that's real. So in some ways, I think the bankruptcy will loom for states. And, as much happens in India, when there's a kick in the pants, things change. So that's I think, my prognosis about this thing, rather than some other factors.
So let's take two at a time.
Can I just add one thing to what Devesh said?
Arvind, you want to speak more?
Just one thing to what Devesh said on. Actually, let's take more questions. Devesh, thanks for the hint.
Thanks for the talk. It was great. I'm Ritika Goyal, a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I actually originally wanted to ask the federalism, like the state, what's the difference in the state question, but now that you've already answered some of it partially, I wondered if, but I'll still ask a brief version of the question, which is if you took that kept only federal state countries in that democracy versus development graph, whether India would still be an outlier. And then the second question that, as you were speaking, as occurred to me, is whether this controlling hyperinflation is also somewhat linked to institutional insulation, but from the political class of the RBI, and how the RBI and experts have been managing some of it. So if you have any comments on whether that is something that has undergone a change, or it's something that was different about India, just in terms of its elites' capacity at the institutional level, at least for some, like in the bureaucracy, in the central bank, etc.
Hello. Hello, Devesh sir, Arvind sir. Thank you for your talk. My name is Soumya. I'm a first-year public administration student here at HKS. So I'm originally from the state of Bihar. And looking at recent reports and just from personal experience as well, we can see the economic growth rate of Bihar, it currently even outpaces the national average. So it's really fast. But we still see that it is lagging a lot when it comes to human development and industrialization. So I just wanted to understand, because Professor Gautam also mentioned about learning from other states, say Tamil Nadu or other high growth states. So I wanted to understand that learning would come when the preconditions are the same. So how much of this lag that we see in human development would be from the historical perspective, say the low industrial base or caste-based politics that we have seen in the past, versus how much of that would be attributed to current or contemporary governance failures? So that's my question. Thank you.
So one of the things about federal systems, large federal systems, and why the question is a little more difficult. What is amazing is how many of them broke apart. So forget growth. Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, massive civil war, large, complex countries. That's where I think India really stands out. That how many of large, complex countries, big systems, federal systems, they just don't exist anymore. And that, I think, is one of the, we argue in the book, is one of the massive positive contributions of democracy in making this complex system work. It's hard to talk about growth and development if the country doesn't exist anymore. I mean, you can talk of the constituent parts in a separate thing, but I think, so that's why you can't per se compare, because the countries themselves just don't exist, right? There's a second part to your question? No.
RBI.
Yeah, so I think there's no doubt that the RBI has been, and has an institutional culture of a relatively conservative institution. And central banks, it's good that they are conservative on the whole, and that is clearly part of the institutional culture. But I think what we argue is that job was made much easier because the pressure from politicians was also less. If the pressure is great, then they will appoint people, because the RBI has actually, there's no statutory independence. So what is remarkable is that it gets that autonomy despite not having the statutory sort of independence. And that shows that the politicians can do much more, but haven't, and there must be other political, factors. Look, the Bihar story, it's hard to, I think one could be cautiously optimistic. See, I think undivided Bihar was the one state that had a natural resource curse, which was Jharkhand. There was a lot of mining revenue, there was a lot of money to grab, right? So they didn't have to do the old needs. The social revolution that comes in the South 60, 70 years ago, it occurs only in the 90s and 2000s, right? And remember, the social revolution occurs in the 1920s. Tamil Nadu is not very different from the rest of India till 1980. So it's a lag of 40, 50 years. We are still not there in the case of Bihar. What we say, but we don't have enough evidence, that Bihar has now elements of what we call a Kerala light strategy. So what we show is that, look, Kerala, the sort of darling development, agriculture failure, industry failure, service sectors, no IT failure. Yet it's the darling development story. And of course, because migration, in this case international, 30% of state GDP is remittances. But that migration itself occurred because of investment in human capital. Bihar, we are seeing for the first time significant migration to the south and to the Gulf. Today, more than half of migration to Gulf from India is from UP and Bihar, not from the south. And you're beginning to see the money flowing back. You're beginning to see attitudes changing of Biharis going to work in Bombay, in the south, and realizing that even in India, things work much better. Why can't it happen in Bihar? So I think that gradual story is plausibly one that one could be somewhat optimistic. Bihar has also some very healthy agricultural growth that's happening. You could argue if it builds on it through agro-industry, which would be a natural forward linkage it could do. So, but above all, I think if a political leadership does not have political imagination, so if in the last elections, the key opposition parties, leaders, the election slogan was a government job for every household. Now, if that is your vision, which is simply nonsense, then you're not going to get there.
So
Arvind, you want to add?
Yeah, on Bihar, see, the whole, as Gautam was saying, that, the fact that 1/3 of India has done so well means we need to look within as well. But on Bihar, what I would say, the more hopeful one is not Bihar learning from Tamil Nadu, because there's still a lot of difference, but there's kind of optimism building around Bihar's neighboring and similar state, which is Uttar Pradesh. Similar caste, similar politics, similar whatever. But I don't want to talk about the leaders, political instincts and social instincts, but there is a sense in which, infrastructure is being built, allowing more scope for the private sector. And more importantly, what Devesh said is, a leader with some vision of development, which I think could be worthy of imitation by, in other words, Bihar is likely to learn more from Uttar Pradesh than it is from Tamil Nadu.
We have time for one more question.
Well, thank you so much. And I have one question for you, Devesh. You spoke about how India spends a lot of time in elections, almost a perpetual state of elections, and how that's sort of increased over since our independence. What are your thoughts on the one nation, one election proposal? Do you think that is fostering democracy or just harming democracy in the shroud of efficiency?
So take one more. I think okay. So we actually discussed that in the book, and we said there are two trade-offs. So one of the things, and you can see it in the US now, right? Federalism is a strong check on an authoritarian central government, right? So Minnesota has some independence in doing some things, and Washington, DC can only do so much, right? And so in India, central and state election results, if you do them at the same time, there is correlation. And therefore, if you expect the states to act as a check on the center, that will become weaker. At the same time, there is strong correlation between state elections and local elections. So if you expect the third tier to act as a check on the second tier, and that's not, let's be very clear, India is extremely centralized at the second tier, much more than comparable countries. So what we argue in the book is you want to balance these two competing goals. One is if you have so many elections, there's a cost, but you also want to have different layers of the state to be a check on the layer above. Therefore, have national and local elections at the same time, because the correlation in outcomes is much weaker, and the state elections is separate. So you don't have one nation, one election, but you have fewer elections and hopefully still some checks and balances.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to thank again Devesh, Arvind, and Dani for participating in this panel. It's been very enlightening. The book is fantastic. I recommend it to all of you. So please join me in thanking our panel.